Okay, welcome everybody. Um, Let me first introduce our two panelists, Peniel Joseph and Bakari Kitwana. Peniel Joseph holds a joint professorship appointment at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and History Department in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. He is also the founding director of the LBJ School's Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. His career focus has been on Black Power studies, which encompasses interdisciplinary fields such as Africana studies, law and society, women's and ethnic studies, and political science. Prior to joining the UT faculty, Dr. Joseph was at Tufts University, where he founded the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy to promote engaged research and scholarship focused on the ways issues of race and democracy affect people's lives. In addition to being a frequent commentator on issues of race, democracy, and civil rights, his most recent book is The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., which he will be talking about today. He's also the author of the award-winning books Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, A Narrative History of Black Power in America, and Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama. His book, Stokely, A Life, has been called the definitive biography of Carmichael. Bakari Kitwana is our discussant today. He is an internationally known cultural critic, journalist, activist, and thought leader in the area of hip hop and Black youth political engagement. The executive director of RAP Sessions, which conducts town hall meetings around the nation on difficult dialogues facing the millennial generation, Kitwana is co-founder of the 2004 National Hip Hop Political Convention. The author of the groundbreaking book, The Hip Hop Generation, he is also the author of Why White Kids Love Hip Hop, and he's collaborating writer for the pioneering hip hop artist Rakim's memoir, Sweat the Technique, Revelations on Creativity from the Lyrical Genius, and he's also co-editor of the new anthology, Democracy Unchained, How to Rebuild Government for the People. This year, he has co-founded the Hip Hop Political Education Summit, which organized virtual day-long summits in the fall of 2020 on voter suppression and Black men and the vote in collaboration with the Black Voters Matter Fund. Please welcome Peniel Joseph as he reads from his book.
Great, thank you, Krishna, so much. It's great to be back at the Hutchins Center, and thank you, Bakari, for being the interlocutor here. So I'm going to read from the epilogue of The Sword and the Shield, and then we can get into our conversation. At various points, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X each utilized the political sword and shield. Together, they represent two at times overlapping and intersecting strains of revolutionary Black activism that continue to animate contemporary Black freedom struggles. Malcolm and Martin collectively grew to define the fight for Black dignity as part of an expansive human rights movement promoting racial equality, economic justice, and an end to war and violence globally. Malcolm's promotion of self-defense to protect Black lives against racial oppression both enlarged the ideological scope of the civil rights movement and obscured his larger political message. He argued that the crisis of race and democracy necessitated a dramatic, collective response to unspeakable political conditions. In contrast, King's commitment to nonviolence masked his philosophy's revolutionary potential and strategic advantages. In a world shadowed by racism, poverty, and violence, King's use of nonviolence seemed to many, especially Malcolm, weak or even cowardly. But many of his enemies and critics knew better, recognizing the aspects of coercive strength and power contained in each collective display of civil disobedience and every act of individual defiance that might lead to nonviolent revolt. King's revolution of values staked its national claim and international reputation on the moral high ground of changing hearts and minds. At the ground level, King, alongside thousands of grassroots activists and organizers, practiced hardball politics that leverage mass demonstrations, protests, boycotts, sit-ins, and jail-ins to start to bring the walls of racial segregation and inequality tumbling down brick by painful brick. While never reconciling their disagreement on the issue of self-defense and violence, over time, Malcolm and Martin came to share views on important issues. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. found common ground and a measure of unacknowledged political convergence through their respective advocacy of Black dignity and Black citizenship. Their lone joint appearance at the US Senate building illustrates their shared belief in the capacity for mass movements to transform democratic institutions. They both came to define America as an empire whose political economy seemed to thrive on racial violence, exploitation of the poor, and war. King's academic study and global travels armed him with an intellectual understanding of world affairs that grew more radical and expansive over time. Vietnam turned him into the nation's sharpest and most vocal critic of American imperialism. Like a man possessed, King raged against the triple evils of militarism, racism, and materialism in a style that shocked critics and might have made Malcolm proud. By the end of their lives, both Malcolm and Martin had sought to leverage international opinion, global political and intellectual networks, and the world stage in an increasingly convergent struggle for Black dignity and citizenship. Malcolm and Martin's enduring influence continues to shape America's contemporary racial and political landscape. Malcolm's ability to connect with Black folk mired in urban ghettos and struggling for survival grew out of his intimate knowledge of racial tragedy, economic injustice, and poverty. He came to understand his time as a hustler, thief, and prisoner as a search for political identity, religious understanding, and personal dignity in America's searing racial wilderness. Malcolm found his vocation as a political organizer, religious preacher, and public intellectual, but always remembered his time in the bowels of urban America, which included stints as a day laborer, Pullman car porter, and factory worker. Before the age of Black Lives Matter, Malcolm X promoted a global movement for Black power that recognized the transcendent dignity of the struggle for Black citizenship in America and beyond. By the end of their lives, Malcolm and Martin had added critical new dimensions to their political and intellectual repertoire. Malcolm X, the most electrifying political combatant for racial justice of his generation, found a state of grace through identification with human rights struggles capable of shielding Black people from sprawling regimes of racial oppression that stretch from America to Africa and beyond. Martin Luther King Jr., the national conscience on race and democracy, took up the peaceful sword of nonviolence to aggressively call for an end to racism, militarism, and poverty. King, like Malcolm, charged America with political crimes from church pulpits across the nation, allegations that pushed him off the list of the nation's most admired citizens, ratcheted up FBI plots to destroy him, and ended his relationship with President Lyndon Johnson. The two men's stature has grown exponentially over the last half century. While Malcolm secured official status as a political folk hero through literary and cultural adoption by generations born after the Black Power era, King became enmeshed in the very discourse of American democracy, enshrined as one of the nation's founders through an annual federal holiday, a memorial in the nation's capital, and global commemorations of his legacy. However, their ubiquitous presence in American popular and political culture flattens a deeper understanding of their legacies. Framing them as simplistic dueling opposites obscures the way in which each served as the alter ego of the other. By the end of his life, Malcolm viewed himself as working in tandem with King, even when he disagreed with the civil rights leader's tactics. And Malcolm's swashbuckling internationalism, which included public criticism of the Vietnam War, offered a framework for King's radical peace efforts 3 years later. Malcolm and Martin publicly debated and privately wrestled over large questions about radical Black dignity and citizenship. Malcolm's scalding critique of American democracy asked why Blacks needed to protest for the citizenship rights constitutionally guaranteed after slavery. Whenever a Negro fights for democracy, he reminded the world, He's fighting for something he has not got, never had, and never will have. Where Malcolm identified democratic failure, King saw untapped potential. At the March on Washington, King urged the nation to make real the promise of democracy. He repeated this phrase in Memphis just before his death. Malcolm found tentative hope in the prospects for Black political power through democratic institutions, but he hedged, offering words of fire, the ballot or the bullet, if Black citizenship was not immediately achieved. King grew increasingly frustrated with the possibility of radical democratic reform, a pessimism that transformed him into a firebrand who publicly questioned the fealty of America's political leaders and citizens to the nation's founding principles. American strength, King argued, required the nation to actively embrace democratic ideals and not simply congratulate itself for having once expressed them. Martin and Malcolm loved Black folks sincerely and unapologetically. Harlem celebrates Malcolm's memory well into the 21st century based on this love, which has been bequeathed to generations of Blacks who remain enthralled by his broad smile, confident oratory, and wicked sense of humor. King's personal ease with the Black poor impressed even his adversaries, who recognized the sincerity of his interaction with elderly, unemployed, and children who flocked to his sermons, political speeches, and public appearances. Spending time with impoverished Black folk in places like Mississippi, Chicago, and Alabama buoyed King, lifting his spirits as his presence captivated poor people who regarded him as a living prophet. Malcolm and Martin continued to offer the world powerful legacies of radical social and political transformation. Contemporary movements for social and political justice have helped to resurrect the historical Malcolm and Martin, challenging the pop cultural icons that each has become. The roiling demonstrations against structural racism in the nation's criminal justice system in the 21st century have coupled the large-scale acts of civil disobedience personified by King's legacy with a defiant critique of the systemic nature of racial oppression that became Malcolm's calling card. These new movements both stand upon and expand on Malcolm and Martin's political legacies, offering an intersectional analysis of race, class, gender, sexuality, and the environment and their connection to Black dignity and citizenship. Through demonstrations, protests, and policy agendas, social justice activists have forcefully argued that America's criminal justice system, persistently segregated and underfunded public schools, and discriminatory finance and housing practices represent a gateway to a sprawling system of racial inequality and economic justice that has grown, not diminished, since the 1960s. There is no way to understand the history, struggle, and debate over race and democracy in contemporary America without understanding Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr.'s relationship to each other, to their own era, and most crucially to our time. The presidency of Barack Obama in many ways helped to frame the limits of a liberal democratic framework rejected by Malcolm X and vociferously criticized by the radical King. Obama's election offered a romantic, although unearned, conclusion to the civil rights and Black power movements without having to examine the underside of the American dream that helped end the lives of Malcolm and Martin. The killings of Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Corinne Gaines, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, Michael Brown represent only the tip of contemporary racial injustice. America has innovated new forms of racial oppression in criminal justice, public schools, residential segregation, and poverty that scar much of the Black community. What Michelle Alexander has dubbed the new Jim Crow, the continuation of a racial caste system through the justice system's disparate treatment of Black prisoners, touches virtually every facet of Black life in America. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. matter now more than ever. The deaths of Gray and Brown triggered urban rebellions in Maryland and Missouri, recalling the spasms of racial unrest that gripped the nation over 50 years ago. Malcolm and Martin argued that the future of American democracy depended on the wholesale recognition of Black dignity and citizenship, struggles that are still ongoing and remain vitally connected to the social movements of the 1960s that they helped to define. Malcolm promoted a bold struggle against white supremacy as the corollary to a passionate crusade for Black dignity. He did more than hurl general accusations. He prosecuted his case through historical methodology that meticulously recounted the litany of crimes perpetrated against Black people. Malcolm's rhetorical sword evolved from brandishing punishing truths about racial injustice into inspiring community pride by offering unmerited grace to all who identified themselves as human rights activists. Martin Luther King Jr. marshaled his love for Black lives through a strategic rebellion that left room for compromise. King's hopes for racial rapprochement with both the architects and beneficiaries of racial oppression faltered in the face of war, racism, and white supremacy. His defense of Black humanity pivoted on a belief in mutual redemption for the descendants of both enslaved Blacks and plantation owners, a faith overwhelmed by a harsh reality of state-sanctioned violence, poverty, and war. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. saw a moral and political reckoning with America's long history of racial and economic justice. Urban rebellion, entrenched poverty, and the tragic resiliency of Jim Crow forced King to confront uncomfortable truths about the depths of American racism. Having successfully climbed previously insurmountable political mountains, King set his sight on scaling the political equivalent of Mount Everest. Whereas Malcolm's philosophy of self-defense grew to include forays into global diplomacy and recognition of the importance of formal voting rights, King's vision of peace acknowledged the need for a nonviolent political war that would be waged by ordinary citizens seeking universal truths through the particular struggles of the poor and racially oppressed. By the end of their lives, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. each drew closer to the political philosophies of the other. The sword and the shield no longer reflecting divergent worldviews, but dual, at times intersecting and even complementary strategies that continue to shape movements for racial justice, dignity, and citizenship in America and around the world. Thank you.
Hey there.
Hey, brother.
All right, man. I got to tell you, when I saw the book and I picked it up, I was thinking, man, reading about the 50s and 60s is like a rabbit hole. It's like tracing your roots. No offense, Dr. Gates. You kind of go down this rabbit hole. You know, I started studying about Malcolm and Martin, you know, as a college student in the 80s, and, you know, felt like I read everything about them that I could get my hands on, and just kind of reached a point where, as an activist, I just kind of felt like, you know, I can't keep studying these guys because I got to live in the present. But reading your book was an absolute breath of fresh air. Really, it surprised me, because my expectation was, what am I going to really learn that I don't know about these guys? But the way that you frame the book, you know, almost like, I don't know, are you familiar with the, I'm trying to think of the scholar, New Testament scholar, Burton Thorpe Morton. He has this parallel gospels text where he puts Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side, right? And you kind of look at them and see, that's what it first made me think of, like, man, this is actually very smart. And it just allowed for you to delve into their lives over, you know, between, say, the 55, 56 up to their deaths in 65, 68, in a way that I just had never imagined. What made you decide to frame it that way?
Yeah, no, thank you, Bakari. I appreciate that. You know, I'm like you. The whole idea of saying, hey, what more can I learn about these folks? Even as a scholar of the Black Power movement and the civil rights movement, there are some of these icons that are just so big, right? And there's a point where you get oversaturated in your own mind with them. You're like, okay, I get it. They were really important. You might read, you encounter them in the archives, you read the big biographies, and I've read pretty much everything I can get a hand on, and also looking at the primary sources. And it was really over time, really working obsessively on the Black Power period and thinking about people more like Kwame Ture, right? Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael. So those folks became my entree into a better understanding of Malcolm and Martin. And I think I was like most people, I got fooled into believing that both of them were less multidimensional and complex than they have been, you know? And I think you know, one of the good things about history and analyzing the archive, and really reading different perspectives. There's a new, Les Payne has a new biography of Malcolm, which I'm really appreciating. And I start to say, well, these two are much more interesting than I think the literature is suggesting, right?
Right.
So even when we think about big biographies, whether it's Garrow or Branch, and then of course, you know, you got Manning Marable, who's one of my mentors, did a Pulitzer Prize winning biography. I was really more interested in placing them within their historical context side by side and seeing how both of them were much more complicated figures. King, radical, the revolutionary king. Malcolm, the person who's Black America's prosecuting attorney, but who also becomes this statesman. And I also wanted us to think differently, because I think sometimes we think to ourselves, well, Dr. King, who's the good guy, over time he influences Malcolm, and Malcolm becomes a better guy.
Right.
What I wanted to show was that the person who really is influencing King is Malcolm. Certainly Stokely does it, but Malcolm lays the framework. And truthfully, you know, we have to admit it, this whole year of Black Lives Matter 2.0 and George Floyd protests, certainly now we have the intersectional, because it's being led by Black women and these, you know, millennial and under Black women. Also with we have older, a generation of elders like Angela Davis and even scholar activists in the academy who are connected to this. But certainly the framework and template for boldly speaking out against white supremacy in the 20th century and into the 21st century, that is set up by Malcolm. That is set up by Malcolm. Yeah. And what King does is enter that template after Malcolm's assassination. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, so such a smart way that you wrote this book. I mean, I even found myself, you know, it's been so long since I've read some of this Malcolm X stuff. I was reading this stuff thinking, man, I almost forgot how much it's influenced my own way I think about politics. So I love the way that you pick these points in history throughout this period, the speeches, the writings, an event here, you know, a national event that happens, international event that happens. How did you decide which ones you were going to build the narrative around?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question, Bakari. I think that I wanted to build the narrative around local, national, and global events. So I think, like in a way, one of the things I foreground the book in after the first two chapters, which are sort of single standalone biographical chapters, but that show some convergence. Like both of them are very much impacted by seeing Gone with the Wind as young people. You know, King is 10 when it premieres in Atlanta, and Gone with the Wind is, you know, crazy racist, the whole deal. And Malcolm actually sees it as while he's in foster care in Mason, Michigan, and says he wanted to crawl under the rug when Butterfly McQueen got into her act. And those of us like you and me who are into pop culture, obviously we know actors like Butterfly McQueen and Hattie McDaniel, they were forced to play these stereotypical roles. Hattie McDaniel famously says, I could play a maid at a movie for $100 a week, or be a real one in real life for, you know, for like less than $10 a month, you know. So people were criticizing, but Malcolm understood that these were stereotypes. And so what I wanted to do, and very early on in chapters 3 and 4, I show how the world stage and anti-colonialism, how they both interact with anti-colonialism, third world and African liberation, anti-imperialism, just very early on in their careers. Malcolm goes to the Middle East for 5 weeks, and King goes to Ghana, and then he spends a month in India in 1957 and 59. So what I had in my mind is pivoting around these events, both global, national, and local. One thing I thought that people hadn't done is that I argue in the book that Birmingham radicalizes the whole country. So for me, I think that 1963, and I have a project now that I'm working on, but I think it's an incredibly important year. And I think Malcolm is radicalized by Birmingham, but so is King. I think you could see the radical King trying to break out, and the angry King. One of the things I most admire about King is what King starts to do is what Malcolm had always learned, is you channel your anger. There's nothing wrong with being angry. And I know you know this, Bakari, even though when you're Black, you're stereotyped as an angry Black man or woman, angry
Right.
Black boy or girl, teenager, young person, right? Malcolm harnesses that anger, right? So it doesn't become a destructive anger. It becomes a useful anger. I would argue that right now in this mean season of 2020, many people are angry. And there's other emotions of being sad, of being mournful, but anger is one of them. King starts to use that. But in 63, you start to see him tap into that anger with what? Letter from Birmingham jail. And the first half of the March on Washington speech is a very angry speech. It's
Right.
an angry speech,
Right.
which is why a lot of folks in the mainstream, they just said, okay, I have a dream. That's it. I mean,
Right.
good, right?
Right.
But he starts that speech off. Now's the time to make real the promise of democracy. And he's talking about racism. He's saying that the governors of southern states, their lips are dripping with the words of nullification and interposition. He says that Alabama is a state filled with vicious racists. I mean, he's saying this live to a national audience.
Right. Right.
And so he's angry and upset. And when you think about Letter from Birmingham jail, when he's talking about how sad and disappointed he is in white liberals who want an unjust peace instead of a chaotic movement for justice, you know, King is really right there. He's really, you know, he's struggling to break out of that shell of moderation. Because when I say King becomes a radical and revolutionary, intellectually, he had always been those things. I'm saying politically.
Yes.
He comes out of that shell. And Malcolm, in so many ways, aids that process in
Okay. Okay. Now, I felt like your frame of the Black radical dignity and Black radical citizenship, were they big enough? And how did you come to choose them? You know, how did you come to choose those terms as how you the terms you're going to frame their thinking around?
You know, it was from reading their speeches, Bakari.
Mhm.
It was from reading their speeches. I thought that one of the big things that Malcolm stresses, certainly the Nation of Islam, but I think Malcolm innovates this, is this idea of dignity, you know? And in a lot of speeches, he talks about how, that's in a lot of speeches, he talks about how what the Nation of Islam has given him and what he wants for Black people is dignity all the world over. And when you read his speeches and how he's defining that, he's really defining that as the end of what he calls world white supremacy, right? And so part of it, when you think of him, when he's part of the Nation of Islam, dignity is connected to racial separatism. And then when he leaves, it's not, because he's expanding his notion of what dignity means. But one of the things I take pains to point out is that when we think about what he meant by racial separatism, he was pushing back against racial segregation, but saying that Black people had to build parallel institutions because it was obvious when you looked at lunch counter sit-ins and the Brown decision and the violence of trying to, that accompanied efforts like Little Rock, Arkansas, to integrate schools. It was obvious that Black people weren't citizens, right? So one, I push back against that. The other is the whole thing with self-defense, that, you know, Malcolm is talking about self-defense, and people who call for self-defense, that is not violence, right? That is not violence. He's saying we're not going to turn the other cheek, but he's saying they're going to resist state-sanctioned violence. So those are really important pivot points with dignity.
Okay.
And then with King, with citizenship, he's constantly talking about citizenship. He's constantly, and I think King, more than even commentators today, realizes that in a democracy, you can't have different classes of citizenship, right? Because sometimes we say second-class citizenship, third-class citizenship. You either are a citizen or you're not.
And here we are.
You know, and we're trying to make that claim. We're making these claims of citizenship. And so what I see with King is that his notion of citizenship goes beyond just public policy with voting rights and public policy with civil rights. He makes an argument that citizenship is not just ending racial oppression, it is the visible appearance of justice. You know, Cornel West, who we love, is always saying, you know, justice is what love looks like in public. That's what King is saying, right? That's what King is saying. And so when I think about those receptacles of the two, there's kind of three kind of metaphors and kind of things that I use. One is the sword and the shield, and making this argument that you know, they're really both sword and shield. You know, we
Yeah.
think Malcolm as the political sword, King as the shield, but they're both. The other is this idea of that Malcolm is pursuing radical Black dignity, King radical Black citizenship. Over time, they converge and come to see
Right.
Black dignity and citizenship. And it's important for us to remember they're using those as universal concepts because King and Martin, Martin and Malcolm are anti-racist. And as you and I know, something that has Black in front of it can be universal. People freak out because of what, Bakari?
Yeah.
Racism.
Yeah.
Because of racism. So if you say Black Lives Matter, you're saying everybody. You really are. And so you can have the universal through the particular struggle.
Right.
So just like we're all taught when we read Shakespeare or we read white Western literature, don't we all have to find ourselves in there, right? We have to find, so there's something, and by doing that, whether you read Chekhov, Russian literature, where you read Kafka, right? Whoever you read, they say, look, find your story in there. And we do. And then when you say, hey, you give them Toni Morrison or Wole Soyinka, or some people are saying, well, this is too African or too,
right,
this is too African or too Black for me. And you're like, well, what about the finding yourself in somebody else's story, which is what we were always taught to do. That's how, you know, we there still have not been no Black James Bond, right? But you still saw those growing up.
Let me ask you, I think that your point, what you're able to do by meticulously lifting up those events and those speeches and those national moments and global moments, I feel like it allows for you to tease out what you're calling a convergence of these identities, which even makes it even feel bigger than a convergence. It feels like an evolution. It's a convergent. It's an ongoing process. And I feel like no other framing of Malcolm and Martin allow for me to feel that in a certain way. I think the tendency is to think of them as they were this one thing and then they evolved into this other thing, right? And some of that is the framing of media, some of it is the historical framing, but I think that that's one of the things that's fascinating. One of the things I'd like you to talk about in a little bit of time we have left is, I felt like there were hidden characters. You know, I feel like you talked about the characters that were present, but then there were hidden characters like gender, like spirituality, and class. How did those shape your writing of this book?
Yeah, no, definitely. Part of what I talk about with Malcolm and Martin and The Sword and the Shield is that they dealt with intersectional issues, but not intersectional identity, right? And so you see, I would probably argue that in some ways Malcolm evolves more over time on gender matters. I think King evolves some, but Malcolm starts to have people like Lynn Shiflett and Black women who are advisors to him politically.
Shirley Graham Du Bois,
who's connected to the Organization of Afro-American Unity, folks connected to Muslim Mosque, Inc. Certainly his older sister, Ella Mae Collins, is his main advisor, as you know, and his wife, Betty Shabazz, too. So I do think that you get in speeches and interviews, in one of his last interviews in '64, he says that the most progressive African countries he visited, Black women were right there, and they were equals. They weren't just so-called helpmates. So I think he is pushing back against the patriarchy, both of the time, but the deeply patriarchal structure and analysis that imbued the Nation of Islam. I think King, it's a harder evolution for him. Obviously, he has run-ins with people like Ella Baker, who could have served as a big mentor, but who he's resistant. King is sort of upholding this patriarchal framework as this Black preacher, right? We do see some later meetings with Black women who are welfare rights activists who sort of tell him to stay in your lane, and if you want to help us, you're going to have to listen, and see the legislation that we want, and he's seemingly receptive to that. But did they have a gender analysis? No, they didn't have this gender. It's gendered to the extent that it's deeply patriarchal, which at times limits their vision and their effectiveness. And I think when it comes to the spirituality part, that's a big part of it. I think they're both faith leaders. A lot of times we discount Malcolm's faith because he's a Muslim. initially as part of the Nation of Islam, and then he takes the Hajj pilgrimage. But in doing so, we treat the Nation of Islam in a different way than we treat just folks who are part of different predominantly white religious traditions, like whether it's Mormonism here or other sects of Christianity that might have started off small, but are still treated with respect. And all of them are going to have their own origin stories and their myths, right? And so I do treat Malcolm respectfully as a Muslim for the entire time since his jailhouse.
Yeah, and I feel like I left your reading of both of them feeling like Malcolm's spirituality was he felt it was more intricately connected to his Blackness and his ideas about Blackness. And I felt like with King, his spirituality seemed more intellectual. I'm curious to know if you talked about it in that way consciously, or if you even feel that.
No, I think they both feel it deeply. I think one of the things I tried to situate King in the context of the Black social gospel. So he feels it. He really, really feels it. And I think that he is mentored by people like Benjamin Mays, the great president of Morehouse. He's mentored by people like Howard Thurman. So I think personally he feels it, but I understand where you're coming from, Bakari. I think King has a hard time just letting loose and jamming in public in terms of his Black self. Okay. So I think that part of what King does is, and I talk about the charges of plagiarism and theological and BU. And I think King is brilliant. I think that obviously that is sloppy scholarship. But I think part of what King suffers from, and Malcolm doesn't, but Malcolm has his own issues that he suffers from that King doesn't.
Right.
But King is trying to put this cloak of white Western erudition on his shoulders, right? And so we even know this from Crozier and Morehouse and then BU, the way King, the timbre of his voice with the white audiences. When the New York Times first comes to the house in 1957, they're playing classical music, Coretta and him. And the New York Times says that, man, this guy can talk about Hegel and white folks, right? And he doesn't want, we all know Dr. King loves some soul food and some fried chicken, the whole like we do, like our folks do, right? But that side you see in private, right? Mm-hmm. That's the private King. I think with Malcolm, the public and private spirituality is more seamless, right? It's more seamless.
Okay.
And with King, I think sometimes people don't get that. King will cite a lot of white theologians, and he's going to cite Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich and Shakespeare and the Bible, but he's also deeply embedded with the Black social gospel tradition that comes out of the 1930s and 1940s. That's deeply anti-racist, and that's very, very Black, and that his father, Daddy King, is a part of, right? So they've been on the circuit, the so-called Chitlin circuit of preaching, and so that is deeply a part of his spirituality. But I think he has a hard time sort of projecting that because he wants to appear so decorous and so officious in that way. So sometimes that respectability politics, a version of it, sort of gets in his way in a way that Malcolm can tap into more readily.
Okay, two more things I want to ask in short because I think we're almost out of time. One, the terminology of white supremacy has seemed to make a resurgence. Something else that Malcolm really popularized. Why do you think that there's a reluctance for a resurgence of the terminology of Black nationalism? Seems like that's not as prevalent as the terminology of white supremacy.
I don't have a problem with the terminology of Black nationalism. I think what people are always trying to push away from is narrow nationalism, right? And you can make an argument that there were aspects of the Nation of Islam by the time you're saying the Yaqub theory that was connected to narrow nationalism. It begins as anti-racism, and then we get into race essentialism. But when we think about tenets of Black nationalism, of unity and political self-determination, the cultural politics of race, and even this idea of decentering Western civilization and thinking about, Africa and a prehistory, all of us, whether you're Haitian or from the Caribbean or from Louisiana, just a history before Western civilization. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I do think people push back against any kind of narrow nationalism that's connected to essentialism.
And then lastly, I think you really do a great job of kind of painting this rich ongoing process for both Malcolm and Martin through these various periods of their lives. What places of traction do we see on the contemporary landscape for moving that same type of interplay of a rich kind of Black political thought that will allow us to kind of move forward in the struggle that we're in now?
I think we're seeing it, Bakari, especially with BLM, and your work has been so pivotal over the last over 2 decades in terms of hip hop and thinking about young people having a political identity, a political framework that goes beyond top-down leadership. And I think BLM is connected. We think about, instead of having Malcolm and Martin, I think we literally have hundreds and thousands of Ella Bakers and Fannie Lou Hamers, and some Martins and Malcolms as well, right? So I think Black Lives Matter, both 1.0 and 2.0, has been really, really important here, because I think what they've done, that movement has really decentered the usual suspects, right, in a positive way. And it doesn't mean that we can't have cisgender Black straight males as part of leadership, but you don't necessarily need to step in front of the line. So we think about Ice Cube, we think about this stuff that's happening, right? Where you got the Tamika Mallory's and the Patrice Concolors and the Ayanna Presley's, and just so much brilliant, beautiful work being done. And it's challenging all of us to center what King and the Bible said, the least of these, right? Or Malcolm was always targeting Black folks who are at the lower frequencies, right? To use the Ellisonian term. So I think that we're seeing it. We're seeing this big evolution where we're not going to be free, Bakari, until we're all free. And that idea of pushing and saying, look, this is our community, and Black women, Black feminism, our queer sisters and brothers, LGBTQIA, the whole deal, non-able-bodied. So I think we're seeing, and then connecting it to those issues of defeating white supremacy and dignity and citizenship that Malcolm and Martin, because those major templates they stay. What we've been able to do better is become more granular in saying who is being oppressed and marginalized, and how does liberation look? Liberation no longer looks as if we can set up parallel regimes of Black patriarchy to coexist alongside white patriarchy. That's liberation. We're saying we want a post-patriarchal Black community, right? A post-white supremacist Black community in America, a post-heteronormative community, right? A post-poor community. And I think that Malcolm and Martin would, in our own time, be right there with us, because they were constantly, like you use your word, Bakari, they were evolving, and that's what we all want to do. So sometimes people say, well, did they? It's not, you don't have to reinvent yourself if you're just evolving. It means you're taking in new information. And Malcolm said this in '64 after the Hajj. They say, what happened to you? And he says, well, travel broadens one, right? And I think we all know that. Those of us who've been privileged enough to be able to travel, you feel different after traveling. You feel energized after traveling, and you learn, right, after traveling. And I think both of these men would have been supportive of these movements that we're seeing today.
Krishna, is it time? Or I know you wanted us to talk about the election stuff.
Perhaps we'll ask if Professor Gates has some comments or questions.
All right.
First.
I was riveted by this conversation. Bakari, you did a great job.
Thank you, sir. I learned from the best.
Exactly.
You mean Krishna. You learned from Krishna.
I followed you around for the last year up there.
And we miss you, man. We miss you, I tell you that.
Miss you too.
Peniel, how much do you attribute let me frame this in a different way. The pressure that Martin Luther King was experiencing from the Black radicals, the Black left, you know, they were calling him Uncle Tom basically in his face.
Yeah.
How much do you think that attributed to his movement to the left, to his including economics in his analysis rather than merely race and the change of heart? You know, I never, well, this is the second question. How much you really believe, how much do you really believe that Dr. King thought that the solution to systemic racism was a change of heart? That we could come, let us reason together, let's hug each other, we shall overcome.
Yeah, you know, I think the first one, Skip, I think that he is influenced by Black radicals like a Stokely Carmichael, but it's a real natural, authentic evolution, right? I think that, you know, he flies into Los Angeles after the Watts uprising. He breaks free from his vacation, and he is heckled by some Black folks who are telling him, hey, here's what the real deal is happening on the ground. And I think what's beautiful about Dr. King is that he is an active listener. You know, we think about King as somebody who speaks, and he's a brilliant speaker, but Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, all these people will say King would listen to you. Like you could spend hours talking to him. And I think the deeper he listened, the more he felt. And I think King was a man of God. I think King had deep faith. And King is somebody who's interested in the Old Testament prophetic tradition and the New Testament, being an apostle, right? And so I think he has his own Paul on the road to Damascus moment, this epiphany where, and I think it starts really in Birmingham, and I think it continues and continues. Then Los Angeles is another epiphany. And how many of us would live in Chicago, in a Chicago ghetto for a year to make a point? And like you said, Skip, those gang leaders, it's not just Memphis, the invaders. This is a very courageous man. There are gangsters in Chicago. They're screaming at him, right? And he's not, we would run. These are hardcore folks. You know, they're coming into the crib armed and screaming at him, and he's listening. Because they're saying, look, it's not working. And at the time, they're saying they're going to do a revolution. King is more seasoned, so he knows, look, you're just going to die. Because the U.S. military-industrial complex, there's not going to be that kind of romantic Che Guevara revolution. King knows this, but he's listening and he's saying, you know what? We need to change before these young people get on some kind of kamikaze mission, suicide mission, whatever. We need to change. And in the other, when you think about hearts and minds, King is trying to do both. I think one of the things that we discount, and this is part of why I wrote the book, King is a master strategist and lobbyist. And I know, Skip, Bakari, you know this. This is not somebody who's just negotiating based on spirituality and religious belief. He is actually trying to leverage transformative public policy and changes. But he's no fool either. He's saying we need to change hearts and minds when you do get the great policy. And I think he's right. You need both, right? You can't just win all the policy victories and have millions of people hating you. Right? You know what I mean? Because after a while, that means every place where there's new policy, there's going to be a new little skirmish and civil war. So you need both, right? You need the different legislation. You need to eradicate the racist policies, but you need people to actually believe this new way of thinking is a good thing, and that we're going to have a consensus around dignity and citizenship. And that's where I think he's this incredible figure. And remember, he goes from being at the White House, bosom buddies with Lyndon Johnson, to saying, look, the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And that's spirituality, that's religion, because you know what that's going to cost you. Especially Lyndon Johnson was, when we think about it, a great friend to the civil rights movement. Lyndon Johnson wasn't Trump. Lyndon Johnson is when you think about it objectively, and you can push anybody and say they should have done more, but objectively in the 20th century, there's not a president who does more for Black people and in support of Black citizenship and dignity than Lyndon Johnson. Was it far enough? No, but there is not another president who does more. So getting on the outs with Lyndon Johnson, and look who came in after Johnson, it wasn't Bobby Kennedy, it was Richard Nixon, right? So I mean, this is a deep religious faith where you're saying, look, I'm going to speak truth to power, because King, and you think about the evolution, Skip, he had read in Life magazine, he saw the pictures of the little babies getting napalm in Vietnam. And that's what after he read that in February, he says, I've got to give a speech, because he says he's giving the speech to save his soul. He starts that speech by saying, there comes a time when silence is betrayal.
No, I agree. That's a great answer. I asked the question because I worry sometimes about this social justice movement that we're in post George Floyd, when a lot of well-meaning, good-hearted people seem to think that it's a matter of converting a racist to a non-racist, rather than understanding it takes trillions of dollars and decades and decades and decades to address systemic racism. That it is our founding mutation. And it's not going to, money's just being thrown here, there, and everywhere. Some of it for good cause. Some of it there's no coordination, there's no logic. The people just reacted because of the horror of George Floyd. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad the corporations and individuals have put up money because of their concern. I worry, however, with the attention span of the American people. I worry that there's no logic to how this money is being spent. And I also worry most of all that there's still a belief that systemic racism can be changed by changing an individual's heart. That's part of it, but that's just a small part of it. As Martin Luther King, as you so eloquently show in your book, as Martin Luther King came to understand.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Skip. I think that with all the money that's been spent, empirically, we haven't seen how much. It's really a drop in the bucket for what's going to need to be regulated and coordinated at the federal level, right? So there's been some things that make sense. I mean, our friend mutually, Philip Goff's Center for Policing Equity, has raised a ton of money. They've raised something like $44 million during this moment. And he's been doing amazing work for years, and now he's going to Yale. And so that makes sense, right? But then, you're right. I mean, these things haven't been that coordinated, but the biggest thing is that it's really not the level of resources that are needed. The only person who can write the check, and like you said, I agree with you completely, Skip, it's multi-decades, it's multi-generational, it's got to be coordinated. But here's where I'll say this. Here's where the hearts and minds does count. All of us who kept thinking that even if a president disagrees with you, you think about Reagan, for instance, right? Republican, Democrat, but if a president disagrees with you, that the rhetoric doesn't matter. The last 4 years have shown us that the rhetoric matters. Right. And so the changing of the hearts and minds is important in the sense that the rhetoric helps to lead to a consensus. Even when we've had the best consensus in American history, post-war American consensus, we know there were still racists, there were still white supremacists. But what Dr. King allows us to do is say that racial justice is going to be part of the consensus of American democracy, right? And I think what BLM allows us to do is saying, hey, intersectional justice is going to be part of the fabric. When you have a president and in a whole political party doing that, and if you have two political parties saying, you know what, we all want intersectional anti-racist justice, but we're going to go about it differently, that matters. And we see right now, the last 4 years shows us how incredibly important it is to have at least even a rhetorical, we can call it realpolitik, we can call it whatever we want, where we say, you know what, we are for this group of people. We're for everybody, but we're anti-racist, we're against anti-Semitism, we're against homophobia and LGBTQ phobia, we're against deep sexism and patriarchy against women. our institutions, we can see now, we need top people saying it, because when you don't, or you say the exact opposite, we're in trouble. Part of what we've seen is that ratcheting up this stuff. We've seen the hate crimes against Black people, against Jews, against Muslims, against LGBTQ. We've seen so many people buy so many more guns. They bought guns during the Obama administration, and people said they bought them because they were scared he was going to take them away. Then Skip, they bought more guns during this administration. And you say, well, why'd they buy more guns in 4 years here than they did? I thought they bought them because of fear. Now they bought them because they're so amped and excited to build a white ethno-nationalist state. So the changing hearts and minds is crucial. We need somebody and an administration, whether that's Biden, Harris, whatever. We need folks who are going to say, citizenship and dignity for all, but yes, there is systemic racism. We are the United States of America. We're going to root it out.
Yes. Krista, I think, is it okay to extend 15 minutes?
Sure. And could those 15 minutes include Bakari and Peniel's thoughts on tomorrow and the election?
Yeah, I will back off because I didn't want to. I know that you have other questions. I'm going to stay on till I have another Zoom call at 2:15. But Peniel, everything you said is true, except for one small factor. 8 years of the first Black president yields the biggest racist in the history of the White House since Andrew Johnson. So all of those words, all of that symbolism, poof, went up in smoke. And that's the last thing I'm going to say.
Yeah, I think it's still there. I think that the Obama impact is still there, but certainly, yeah, I think that the last 4 years have been just a nightmare.
Bakari, would you
Yes.
like to weigh in on the election, and then perhaps Peniel and maybe Skip as well?
Yeah, the election. Well, I mean, I think that a couple of things. One, I'm in Ohio, Cleveland area. We actually have Joe Biden flying in today. Probably he may have already come in and left at this point, headed to Pittsburgh. We've had a bunch of folks in, Kamala Harris last week. A lot of interesting activity on the ground. Early vote has doubled from 2016. We have seen a little bit of voter intimidation, but mostly out in the rural areas. And interestingly enough, in Lorraine, a bunch of Black preachers standing their ground against these knuckleheads with these guns, trying to intimidate people. Also, Black preachers really showing up. Dr. Gates, we have Bishop Reed is now doing a regional position here. I believe he's in the Columbus area, and those folks with the AME have been very much out front, leading folks, and really excited about trying to push back against the current administration. So that's some of the stuff we have. One of the things when I talk to some of the local activists that they are worried about is they're worried about whether or not Black men and Latino men are going to show up. We did a big program last week, collaborated with Black Voters Matter, One Hood Media, and Faith in Action, Live Free, around Black men in the vote. We called it Brothers Gonna Work It Out, and got to hear from a lot of, we put grassroots activists in conversation with political hip hop artists like M1 the Dead Prez and Professor Griff and Lord Jamar and folks like that. And so interesting conversations, and I think people are really excited and really, I think, looking for ways to make a change and not just cave in to the madness.
Yeah, I think that the big thing that's happening right now is, and moving forward, we have to think about just voting rights and having a Voting Rights Act that's passed, that covers all 50 states, and that has a lot more uniformity in terms of the mail-in ballot system, polling locations. There's so much voter suppression that I think that even though, like, I'm in Texas, and We have already voted at 104% capacity from 2016. I voted early the first day, and we still have tomorrow. But there's been so much embarrassing and dangerous voter suppression here from the governor on down. And people are challenging Houston, Tarrant County, 127,000 folks have voted through drive-in because of the pandemic. And they've tried to do lawsuits. The Texas State Supreme Court just rejected that, but they're going to federal court, right? And so what we all have to face, those of us who are interested in justice, and this is really away from even partisan lines, is one major political party right now, and this is the Republican Party, the GOP, their whole strategy is voter suppression. Their political strategy is voter suppression. And so that is exceedingly dangerous because the president has put 300 federal justices in the federal and the appellate courts. There are 6 Supreme Court justices now with Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And what we're seeing is that justices that are Republicans at all walks of life are supportive of voter suppression. This is anti-democratic. This is unconstitutional. This is, so we're in trouble as a democracy. And that's where, yeah, in terms of hearts and minds, but the process right now is illegitimate, the process, right? The voting process. Because here's what I'll say, Krishna, if every single American who wanted to vote was allowed to vote in this election, the current administration would be wiped out. And the current Republican Party, including in multiple state houses in the United States of America, would go down in defeat, right? And so the only collective strategy is to deny the right to vote. And certainly it's Black folks they're denying the right to vote, but they've become more surgically precise. It's not just Black and brown and poor people they're denying. They know through computers and algorithms where blue voters and registered Democrats are. So they're trying to suppress registered Democratic voters throughout the United States. That's one of the missing stories here, because they're focusing absolutely on Black people, but they're focusing on the other party in the blue states, but also even within blue districts, right? And zip codes within red states, because like Austin is, Texas is a sort of a purple state. Austin's very blue. And so they're focusing on places where you have rural counties, where there are blue voters, Democratic voters, to suppress those votes. So I'm excited that so many young people are part of this election. But when we think about Georgia and Texas, and I waited 2.5 hours in line to vote the first day of voting on October 13th, President Obama on election night on 2012, before a national audience, I remember talked about that people waited hours in line to vote, and we were going to have to fix that, do something about that. It didn't happen. So in fact, what we got was Shelby v. Holder, a divided Supreme Court 5-4. And we can never forget this. Everybody, Skip, Bakari, what taking away Section 5 of preclearance did is it single-handedly destroyed the work of Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, who we're going to get a great new biography from. Tamika Brown-Nagin is doing that. It single-handedly did this. So you talk about generations of people who fought and died overseas and domestically to protect the right to vote. Barbara Jordan co-sponsored in 1975 the extension that included Texas. Texas was part of this from 1975 to 2013. And during those 48 years, the DOJ had blocked dozens of efforts by Texas to do voter suppression. Since 2013, Texas has closed down over 700 polling locations, predominantly in Black and brown and blue places, right? That's what, so this is, and Skip has the book, Stony the Road. This is just like Stony the Road. And we think about Reconstruction and the intimidation, but what they call the Black codes, right? The Black codes, right? And even in Florida, we did heroic work to re-enfranchise predominantly Black men, not exclusively, but predominantly Black men in Florida. And they introduced a new poll tax. When LeBron James paid the poll tax for 30,000 people, they threatened to sue him and put him in jail. That's what Republicans threatened to do. When LeBron James raised money to paid off for thousands, right? So I just want us to all know that the excitement is that so many people are voting, and I think we have to obviously keep this up. Voting is the tip of the spear of citizenship, but we need legislation on day one in 2021. Part of the 100-day, if Biden Harris get in, just like the New Deal and Roosevelt, in the first 100 days, there should be a John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. John Lewis is an American hero, passed away, Congressman John Lewis. His head was bloodied. They always keep on saying Edmund Pettus Bridge. It's not just that. They fractured his skull as a freedom rider. So it's twice. It's 61. I mean, he had a hard head, 61 and 65. And he was fine. He's fine. Like cognitively, he never lost it, right? So can you imagine? I mean, the angels were protected twice, 61 and 65. And they did it enough where you could see stuff oozing through his head. I mean, this is insanity. And so we should have a John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, chairman of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the last living speaker at the March on Washington, a disciple of Dr. King, really one of the greatest Americans ever, John R. Lewis, who we've all knew here. And we should do that day one. So I think I'm both emboldened but saddened that we have one major party whose strategy is voter suppression in the United States of America.
Do you have any more final thoughts, Bakari and Skip? Most of our questions revolve around the election, and our attendees would like to know your thoughts. So
Okay.
we can.
I think let's defer to the questions, huh?
Most of the questions revolve around the election and your thoughts.
I see.
So we can continue with that, or we can conclude and see each other on the other side.
Well, one of the things I would point to is, in response to both you, Dr. Gates, and Dr. Joseph, is Black Voters Matters. They have been calling for a Department of Democracy, which I think is an interesting idea that would be created to govern all of these election problems that we have. That's one idea that I've seen that I think is interesting, that would kind of start to address things like the Electoral College and people not having the different states not being uniform in their approach to voting, and et cetera. So, I mean, I think that there's that. I also think there's a young activist, Nick Retard, who is working around states' rights and believes that a lot of working at the state level, and feels that a lot of the battles that people on the left are losing are at that state level. So I think that that's another interesting place. And then, of course, there is always this recurring idea of a third political party or force, which I think becomes popular during election years. Even you had P. Diddy saying there need to be a Black People's Party a couple of weeks ago. But these ideas, I feel we need people to be as excited about them, after the election as they are as we're on the eve of one. The book that I co-edited, Democracy Unchained: How to Rebuild Government for the People, takes on a lot of these ideas. One of the contributors is Mayor Raz Baraka. He's talking about what can be done at the city level of a Marshall Plan for America's cities. Rashad Robinson is another contributor, Color of Change, and some other folks, Michael Eric Dyson and others. So I think there's some ideas there for what needs to be happening at the State Department level, what needs to be happening at the level of judges, et cetera. And I think we need more of that conversation ongoing. We have a series, which is State of American Democracy, if folks are interested. It's Thursdays, about an hour long every Thursday, stateofamericandemocracy.org.
Thank you. Well, this has been a great session. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks for having
Peniel.
me.
Thank you, Bakari. It was fabulous. Good luck tomorrow.
Everybody vote.
At least I voted already, man.
Well, everybody on this call, just vote. I mean, vote.
Everybody vote and pray. At least the nightmares. Oh, I don't know if they'll end. I started to say, every night I have nightmares. Maybe they'll end tomorrow night. Maybe they get worse.
No, I think we're in for a good evening.
Let's pray, man. Keep praying. Peniel, I love you. You know that.
Yeah, thank you. Love you, Skip. Thank you so much. Bakari, Krishna, and Abby, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You kiss my goddaughter, okay?
Yeah, she's right upstairs. Yeah, zooming to kindergarten these days.
Yeah. Bakari, God bless you. You did a great job, my brother.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care.
Hope to see you soon.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Bakari.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.